Well, while they're pulling up my slides, I'll introduce myself. I'm Aaron Josephson. For those of you looking at the back of your badge and wondering where I fit on there, as Don mentioned, I'm filling in for Bethany Hills, who works for the law firm Mintz Levin. I work for the consulting arm of that law firm, ML Strategies. And what exactly qualifies me to be here today is that I spent over 10 years working at the FDA. And so Bethany is a food and drug lawyer. I worked on a number of issues impacting food and drug law while I was at FDA, including those related to biologics, drugs, and most recently medical devices. And I'm, among other topics, I was involved in writing the 21st Century Cures Act, provisions of the 21st Century Cures Act, which dealt a lot with how software is regulated, how FDA should regulate software, or rather how FDA should not regulate software. And so I'm glad Lisa went before me, because I think a lot of what she was talking about in terms of evidence is important as FDA is now thinking about how to change the approach to regulating medical software. So, as folks have said, we're here to talk about digital development, de-risking digital development. I'll focus on really how the landscape is actually complex and evolving. It has been for several years. As time goes on, it doesn't seem to be getting any less complex. And beyond being evolutionary, I believe, and I think a lot of others would say, what FDA is proposing to do with respect to regulating digital health is actually revolutionary. And I'll explain why I think that later. So having just come from FDA just a couple months ago, I like to also, or maybe it's a habit I need to break now that I'm no longer working for the government, but I do like to hearken back to FDA's mission, and in this case, I think it's relevant to also talk about the vision of the Device Center. So you'll see I've highlighted a couple terms here. The FDA mission is largely about protecting and promoting public health. So the term on their website these days is advance, in the context of public health, so advance or promote is fine. But in the context of the Device Center's vision, there's quite a lot in there, actually. And I actually used to start presentations by talking about the vision. But the thing I want to focus on is the point about access. So if folks are familiar with kind of project management, there's kind of typically three things that you have to consider: scope, time, and cost. And usually if you mess with one, the other two are impacted. So I want you to think about, as I'm talking through what FDA is doing with respect to medical software, how the three kind of prongs protect public health, protecting patients, advancing innovation, and boosting the industry, and also making sure patients have access to new technologies, how those three things kind of form a triangle in the same way, and how playing with one can mess with the others. But before getting too far down, I do want to take just a second to remind people what a medical device is. Software can be a medical device. It fits under this definition. This is a definition from federal law, not FDA's definition. And software is typically considered a contrivance among the things that are listed there, or it's a component or an accessory of a device. It also is intended to affect the structure or function of people. It does not achieve its primary intended purpose through chemical action. Essentially, it's not a drug. And the intended use of a product is typically what makes FDA interested in regulating it in a certain way. So you can have a lot of products that are out there that do a lot of things that maybe you would think would be FDA-regulated software devices. But if they don't claim to be, then there is potentially an out for them. Again, coming from FDA, I kind of want to make sure folks understand the breadth of of things that they have on their plate, and it's quite a bit. There's a lot of devices out there. There's a lot of manufacturers out there. They receive a lot of reports of malfunctions and adverse events, and all of this is I think necessary to provide some context for how FDA is dealing with this large volume. FDA is not a fully funded agency. I'm not sure any federal agency would consider themselves fully funded. But FDA has a number of strategies for dealing with what they consider challenges from a resource perspective of addressing these challenges from a public health perspective. And those are the few things I have listed here. So the first thing that FDA has been doing over recent years is shifting its oversight from the pre-market setting to the post-market setting. And what this means is that from a resource perspective, you could argue FDA doesn't have the resources to take a look at all the technologies that are coming in. There's a lot of novel things. They would rather allow that with some kind of basic review, allow those things out on the market, then collect evidence about them to make sure that once they're marketed, they're safe and effective. And how do you do that is with the next two things. You use patient input and you use real-world evidence. So I think folks here are probably pretty familiar with real-world evidence. In the FDA parlance, it's a lot of routine clinical data from routine clinical care. Things like data from electronic health records, things like data from claims registries, or claims databases, things like data from registries, and also patient input. So things like, what my watch is telling me about my heart rate right now, or other things where patients are asked in a survey, how are you feeling today? All these things are kind of what FDA is looking to gather, and it's all in with this intent to get patients access to products earlier, right? So remember, the three prongs was protecting, advancing, and access, and this is really about access. The other thing is that FDA is quite good at deregulating, actually, especially in the sense of devices. And especially in the past few years, FDA, as far back as 2013, FDA said, we're not going to look at a lot of devices that have general wellness claims. But aside from that, they've also deregulated over 1,000 types of devices and said, we no longer need to see data on these devices in the pre-market setting. We trust that complying with what are called general controls, essentially that a company has a quality system in place and some other things, is sufficient to protect public health. And then the last thing is a relatively new idea that FDA has been exploring in a couple of contexts, and that is to pre-certify organizations. And FDA would either do this or accredit a third party to do the certifications. But essentially, they're saying, we trust that if you're certified, you have the capability and you are producing safe and effective medical devices. And so, why spend so much time on all these different things? How does this relate to software and digital health? Well, these 5 things are really kind of the foundation for what FDA is doing with digital health, and especially the last one. So FDA is putting a lot of its eggs into this pre-certification basket, so to speak. And the problem is that they don't have the expertise or the capacity to review complex digital health technologies, or that's an argument. FDA would also say that they don't have the regulatory framework, the existing legal model, is not well suited to regulating things like software. Software is constantly being updated. It's a very iterative process. The shortest review time in statute for something, for a new application at FDA, is 90 days. It's not in reality 90 days. It's usually somewhere around 100. And so there are concerns that the timelines that FDA is reviewing things don't actually work very well. And I'll talk about whether that's actually the case or not. But their solution, or their proposed solution, is this pre-certification model, where they would go into a company and evaluate whether it has a culture of quality and organizational excellence. And if you're wondering, if you're thinking, oh, that sounds really good, but it's extremely vague, and what does that really mean? The short of it is that FDA is still not even sure what it means, and they've put out a framework to kind of solicit public comments on it, and they've gotten quite a few public comments, but they're looking for things that are essentially, do you have? I consider it kind of like quality system on steroids. And so I think one of the things a lot of people are looking for FDA to do is clarify, how does this culture of quality and organizational excellence go beyond what a basic quality system requirement is? And FDA is still kind of hammering out those details, but you can see some of the excellence principles I've listed, are that a company does testing well, hires the right people, has the infrastructure to actually support what they say they're doing, kind of in advance solutions to problems that they see often on the back end with companies. This system relies heavily on post-market surveillance, which is an issue potentially that I'll get to in a minute. And I'll point out too that the idea is not without controversy, even at the highest levels of government. Some members of Congress, some senators, including from Massachusetts, recently sent a letter to the FDA commissioner and the director of the Device Center asking, essentially, what is the legal authority that you are doing this under? And kind of what are the data requirements? How do you actually ensure that companies are behaving excellently and have a culture of quality? What does that actually mean? Because in the current model, you can use data to demonstrate that a product is safe and effective. If you're relying on the kind of this certification that a company operates excellently, a lot of people, including Congress, want to know that there was data backing that up. So I mentioned earlier, this is revolutionary. This is kind of the revolution in short. Essentially, FDA is moving from regulating a product to regulating a product developer, and this would be the first time that is happening since FDA was created. And I won't go into the details here because I know we're running short on time, and I do want to get to some of the other key points. Essentially, why should you care? I think, first of all, we're at a technology summit, so you presumably have some interest in the topic. But this is really about access to safe and effective products. FDA is saying that this will provide better access to novel technologies. There also might be new approaches. For those of you who are clinicians or researchers, there may be new approaches for generating evidence based on use of these novel technologies. Something like the Apple Watch that didn't even exist a few years ago is now being used to measure EKGs. And so how can that be used, and similar things in the future? But it's not without risk, and since that's one of the key points of our discussion today, I did want to highlight a few things. So I mentioned that the system relies heavily on post-market data collection and surveillance. That system is extremely immature, and that's my assessment, having worked at FDA and actually having worked on the solution that FDA is pushing, which is called the National Evaluation System for Health Technology. It is a network of organizations that are trying to improve the quantity and quality of data that's available from things like registries, electronic health records, claims databases, and other sources. So FDA is trying to use that. They're pushing this very hard, but the question still remains, how does this fit in? Will it be ready in time for products to use before FDA lets those products on the market? Another risk, or another concern at least, is will patients and practitioners have confidence in products that are not FDA approved or cleared, right? Right now, you have a product on the market. It has a kind of a figurative stamp of approval that FDA reviewed data about it and made a determination that it is safe and effective. That goes away under the new model. FDA is saying that any company that is certified would be that a product that they make would be safe and effective. But is that necessarily true? Which kind of brings me to the next point, which is, are we opening ourselves up as patients and consumers to vulnerabilities that, with FDA oversight, there would be some mitigation potentially built into the review process to catch issues. There are liability issues as well. Without getting into too much of the legal issues, right now, if software makes a bad recommendation, it's unclear exactly who would be to blame and who would be to blame kind of in this future model. And as there are discussions about kind of improving the legal framework around this, will certain entities seek to indemnify themselves against blame? And then the last item here, at least, is political, and I mean that I should have put it with a lowercase p, because I don't mean political in terms of Congress and Democrat, Republican, although that is an issue. But I mean in terms of when you're developing a new system and you're opening up to public feedback in the way that FDA has. Now, you're going to get a lot of opinions, and you're going to get a lot of people acting in their own interest and submitting comments to FDA that reflect, a position that advances their interests. And how FDA manages all that will have a big effect on what the final deal looks like. So, one of my examples of how this technology that has actually gone through FDA's program is the pear product that we heard about. But one of the reason, without going into the details because it's been covered, but one of the things that I'll ask you to think about is this went through the existing FDA system, and it relied heavily on evidence that we heard about, from Lisa's presentation. A lot of work that went into running trials and getting information. Does that necessarily go away, or does the fidelity of the studies change that go into making a product actually something that gets FDA approval? Or rather, FDA is not approving products anymore. So how does that play into the desirability of these products on the market? This is not just an issue for devices. There's also drugs out there that have sensors. We heard earlier that there are sensors in kids' underwear, apparently, to track where they're going with their parents or not. But you can also put a sensor in to a drug, and they are. This is also something that went through the existing FDA paradigm. So what is it about the new model that solves a problem here, right? What's the problem that really needs to be solved? And so this is just a quick note that FDA is still looking into new ways of innovating, and it seems like they're moving full speed ahead. The commissioner of FDA recently said that they're going to essentially what seemed to me to be implementing kind of this pre-certification model kind of before it's quite fully baked. He's saying that software applications related to a drug are not going to need to go through FDA review. But there's a lot of questions still about how this is, how they're going to be regulated then. So this is in summary, my summary slide. FDA is moving full speed ahead. They have user fee commitments to the industry and to the Congress related to setting up a digital health program. It's part of their general strategy. I would say to folks here and elsewhere, it's okay to challenge underlying assumptions. I think I don't want to come off as too negative on this. I actually think it's a good idea, but I think it needs to be thought through a lot more, and FDA is moving very quickly with it. So, some of the assumptions are that maybe the current regulatory model does not work very well, but we've seen with PAIR and with the Abilify example, at least two examples of how it does work. FDA is open to feedback, so don't be shy about sharing your opinions. They're working on it and will be issuing something public later this year. Congress and others are watching closely, and I will be too. And you can look to my firm's blog to see more about this. That's it for me. Thank you.